In the 1950s, Cuba was one of the most prosperous countries in the world. It had more doctors per capita than France, a life expectancy similar to that of Italy, and a GDP per capita that exceeded that of Spain. Cuba exported sugar, welcomed American tourists, had movie theaters, new cars, international banks, and active trade networks. However, within just a few years, Castro's revolution turned Cuba into one of the poorest countries in the world. But there was another big loser in this story: the United States. For almost 60 years, the United States had dominated the Cuban economy. It controlled most of the agricultural land, service companies, banks, and most importantly, it had the right to intervene militarily on the island thanks to the Platt Amendment. For many Cubans, like Fidel Castro, this was a symbol of national humiliation and submission. That's why their goal with the revolution was not only to overthrow the previous dictator, but also to break ties with Washington. What's more, although we now all associate Cuba with socialism, what if I told you that the revolution was not originally communist? Take a look at what Fidel Castro said himself.
My movement has nothing to do with communism. My movement is authentically Cuban. There are no communists in the government. It is not a communist revolution. It is a humanist revolution.
Fidel Castro was not a communist from the beginning. In his early years, as a revolutionary leader, he avoided defining himself as a Marxist-Leninist and publicly rejected the Popular Socialist Party. When the revolution triumphed, the regime maintained private industry for months and allowed the internal market to function. Again, the Cuban Revolution was not communist, and the question many of you are probably wondering is, when did everything change? It's true that the Cuban Revolution was not communist, but it's also true that it was deeply anti-American. That's why, when he came to power, Castro punished many US companies and capitalists, agrarian reforms, nationalization of companies, asset freezes. In other words, although the revolution was not anti-capitalist, it was anti-American capitalism. Obviously, the US wasn't going to sit idly by. Washington responded with economic embargoes and supported attempts to overthrow the new regime, such as the Bay of Pigs invasion. However, instead of ending the regime, these actions further fueled the revolution. Fidel Castro reaffirmed his belief that the US would not allow an independent Cuba. It was either Cuba or the US. But how could a small island stand up to the Yankee Empire itself? Well, the answer was waiting on the other side of the Atlantic. You know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that's when the Soviet Union came into play. For the Soviet Union, Cuba was a sweet treat. It had an unbeatable strategic position. So much so that, as you know, it later became a bastion of Soviet nuclear weapons, just 150 kilometers off the coast of Florida. But to get to that point, the USSR needed to secure Cuba's friendship at all costs. The advantage was that it also knew that the Cubans needed both economic and military support to defend themselves against Uncle Sam. Conclusion: Fidel allied himself with the Soviets, ended up declaring the socialist nature of the revolution, and the regime openly adopted Marxism-Leninism as the economic model. Over the following decades, Cuba became a key player in the socialist bloc. It supported revolutionary movements in Africa and Latin America. Cuban professionals participated in conflicts such as the wars in Angola and Ethiopia. And worst of all, for the United States, the island became the backdoor for the ideological export of communism. In short, within just a few years, Cuba went from being an economic and tourist hub closely linked to Uncle Sam to being the continent's #1 enemy. The question is, how could the US have done anything to stop it? Well, it certainly tried.
60 years of US embargo on Cuba and no change in sight.
If we rule out direct military intervention due to the obvious risk of war with the USSR that this would entail, the only option to bring down the Cuban regime was to attack its economy. And it was precisely at this point that the well-known embargo was imposed. The idea was simple: impose trade sanctions on Cuba, suffocate its economy, and create a social pressure cooker that would force the regime to fall. An embargo that has survived 11 US presidents, 12 popes, the moon landing, a global pandemic, and which, even today, more than 6 decades later, remains in force. Washington opted for isolation as a political weapon, trusting that time would do the rest. The problem is that the embargo was only half successful. That is, it achieved its goal of of suffocating the economy, or at least crippling it. But after 63 years, the regime remains intact. Cubans are increasingly poor, and there is no solution in sight.
Cubans queue overnight for scarce food and medicines amid crisis.
In Cuba, there are ration cards that determine how much food each person can buy. To give you an idea of the drama, each Cuban gets about 3 kilos of rice, half a kilo of chicken, 5 eggs, half a kilo of beans, half a litre of oil, and a few minor items such as sugar or coffee. Beef is considered a privilege only suitable for the sick or young children, and in a good month, you might get a packet of spaghetti. It stands to reason that no one can live on such a poor diet, so in the end, many turn to informal markets with sky-high prices. The question is, knowing all this, does it really make sense to maintain the embargo on Cuba? Why haven't the sanctions succeeded in overthrowing the regime 6 decades later? How would lifting the sanctions affect the island? We're going to look at that right now. The US embargoed Cuba to sink its economy, force social protests, and bring down the economy. What it didn't count on was that the Soviet Union could act as a counterweight. For more than 3 decades, Moscow sustained the Cuban economy with subsidies and preferential trade. Do you want an example? The price of sugar. While sugar prices plummeted on the international market, the USSR paid Cuba almost 5 times more per ton. This difference guaranteed the Castro government sufficient income to maintain imports, the health system, education, and basic rations. In essence, it was a kind of covert subsidy, but it was not the only one. To keep factories and transportation running, the USSR sent Cuba more than 13 million tons of oil per year. The curious thing is that this oil was sent even when the Soviets themselves were suffering internal crises. But the Cubans resold it on the international market to obtain foreign currency. Cuba was the empire's darling island, and the aid was not only economic. The USSR also sent doctors and engineers to work in industry. In other words, its support not only allowed Cuba to survive the embargo, but also to maintain a constant level of well-being for its population. Or at least this was the case until the fall of the Union. In 1991, the USSR collapsed. Aid and ships carrying engineers stopped arriving. That was when the so-called special period began, a crisis so severe that in just a few months it caused GDP to plummet by more than 30% and wiped out 80% of foreign trade. This crisis showed how much the regime had depended on the Soviets and made it clear that they had to react. So, how did they solve the problem? Mainly in 2 ways. The first was to open up trade and some foreign investment. Tourism returned to the island, the dollar was legalized, and better trade relations were established with China and Europe. But the second was to find a replacement for the USSR, a new oil dandy. And what other socialist country, also an enemy of the US, had oil to give away? Venezuela, of course. In the 2000s, Castro's regime signed a strategic alliance with Hugo Chávez's Venezuela. The deal was as follows. Venezuela would give cheap oil to the Cubans, and in exchange, Cuban doctors and technicians trained in the Soviet Union would go to work in Venezuela. Well, this has been the situation in Cuba since then, more or less, with constant patches on a failed system that depended on foreign aid. Over time, the patches weakened. Venezuela's alliance grew weaker, and sooner rather than later, something happened that had never happened on the island in 60 years of revolution.
Cuba recorded 3,300 protests in 2021. Rare protests break out in Cuba amid electricity and food shortages.
First in 2021 and now in 2024, with a new wave of poverty, Cubans are taking to the streets. Note that it has taken several decades to reach this point. Is this the beginning of the end of the regime? Will the embargo finally achieve its goal? Well, let's see. Thousands shouting in the streets doesn't mean that the regime is faltering. It doesn't even mean that it's weaker. Protesting is not synonymous with transformation. Recent history is full of examples. Venezuela has had crowded squares and massive demonstrations for years, and Maduro remains firmly in power, more authoritarian than ever. Dictatorships are dictatorships for a reason, and just as Maduro can cling to power through fear in Cuba, the same thing is happening here.
Cuba, arrests and systematic abuses against peaceful protesters.
Selective arrests, armed forces against protesters, internet blackouts, and tight control of information to make the protests look like isolated incidents. Of course, power here is not only sustained by fear, but also by a well-oiled system of rewards. There are networks that offer homes, access to food, and privileges to those who remain loyal to the regime. And so, a significant portion of the population has reasons not to break the status quo, even in the midst of the crisis. On the other hand, the protesters don't follow clear leadership. Without a solid project, without a plan to organize and articulate real support, the anger of the people remains anecdotal. Let's be clear, the regime does not look like it will fall in the immediate future, and the embargo will not achieve its objective. And I'll tell you something else, it will most likely only make things worse. A recent study by Felbermeyer has found that a trade shock between Cuba and the United States significantly reduces the country's GDP, but does not significantly affect government consumption. In other words, the embargo is harmless to the regime, but at the same time, it's leaving the population without the resources to defend itself. How is that possible? There are two reasons. The first is that, in the face of sanctions, the government can raise taxes, print money, and have more justification for squeezing the population. The government never loses. But at the same time, bureaucrats can blame the crisis on the US embargo instead of admitting that their model doesn't work, which gives many Cubans who support the regime the perfect excuse to defend the government in the event of a possible rebellion. Remember, this is not just a theory, it's something that has also been seen in other places, such as Iran. For decades, the West has opted for a middle ground between diplomacy and war against Iran. Sanctions, a supposedly surgical tool designed to apply pressure without firing a shot. But if sanctions worked as promised, how do we explain what is happening today?
Israel strikes Iran's nuclear sites and kills top generals. Iran retaliates with missile barrages.
Iran has not only resisted the pressure, it has learned to live with it. So much so that it has been developing its own nuclear program. Sanctions did not isolate it. They pushed it to build an alternative world. With the enmity of the US, Iran had to build new alliances. Turkey, China, Russia, Lebanon. If you look closely, it's similar to what Cuba did first with the Soviet Union and then with Venezuela and China. Sanctions have an effect, but they are not usually invulnerable. In fact, returning to the case of Iran, not even allied countries agree on imposing sanctions all at once. For example, even within the European Union, while trade with Iran fell by 99% in Finland, it remained virtually unchanged in Greece. If we look at other cases beside Cuba and Iran, we find that economic sanctions do not usually work to subvert dictatorial governments. Quite the contrary. In a study by political scientist Dursun Pekson, which looked at a sample of 95 countries that endured sanctions between 1981 and 2000, it was found that sanctions increased abuses of power, crimes against human rights, and ultimately achieved the opposite of what they intended. But then, if after 60 years, and with all the historical evidence we have, we already know that sanctions are not good for anyone, why are they still in place? The embargo on Cuba is not maintained because it works, it's maintained because it suits certain people, and not just anyone, a very specific group of players with a lot of power. An ideological lobby that has built its entire political identity around putting pressure on the Cuban regime. Basically, it's a political tool to win elections. It's easier to say that we need to take a hard line against dictatorship, not reward oppressors and defend freedom from exile. These messages stir up strong emotions and connect with history, identity, and the trauma of the people. Nevertheless, as studies show, they aren't true. Those harmed by the sanctions are the Cuban people, not their rulers. Every 4 years, the Cuba issue returns like a mantra. It doesn't matter what happens on the island. What matters is how it's perceived in Florida, where there is a very significant Cuban population. Every candidate promises more pressure, more firmness, more sanctions, because they know that a handful of votes in this state can tip the national balance. And with that said, it's your turn. What do you think about the embargo on Cuba? Do you think it will ever be lifted? Will the Cuban people manage to overthrow the regime? Well, you can leave me your answers down in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every week, so subscribe to this channel and click the bell icon so you don't miss any of our updates. If you liked this video, give it a like, and I'll see you in the next one. All the best. See you next time.